I was thinking it sort of reminds me of this book club that I'm in, where we get together every few months, we laugh, we cry, we talk about our problems, we drink lots of wine, and then we wake up the next day and we sort of slip back into our same routines and we move on. So I'm hoping today, during this discussion, we can maybe put some markers in the ground as to actually how we do move forward with what is a very, very serious problem in Illinois, the city of Chicago, and municipalities statewide. We had an editorial in yesterday's Tribune touching on some of the other city governments that are dealing with the squeeze of pension costs. It's very real, and it's something that Springfield really needs to focus on and fix. My hope is that we will talk about the need for possibly a constitutional amendment to change pensions, and perhaps why the Democratic majority in Springfield gets to pick and choose what we get to vote on. We'll get to that with Senator Steans, perhaps. I know some of the mayor's finance people are here, and as she has stepped out and offered to take on some sort of a statewide movement for pensions, I hope we can talk a little bit about what that means and if it gives us new hope for change. I'd love to talk a little bit about what Arizona did, had similar pension language in their constitution and was able to make some changes to sort of curb some of those costs. And then I just wanted to take 1 second to introduce my special guest today. Her name is Elizabeth Bauer, if you could wave. This is at Jane the Actuary on Twitter. That's how we met, because that's how all friends meet now. And we used to be, a couple of years ago, I think, tweeting back and forth on a Friday or Saturday night. That's what we do. We're home alone and we're tweeting about pensions. So she has some great material up now if this is something you follow and you're here. So obviously you do. She's at Jane the Actuary on Twitter. Without further ado, we're going to have our panelists talk for, I think, a couple minutes each. And then I have some questions for them, and I already have a big stack of questions from you, and that's most important. So without further ado, we'll start immediately to my right with Adam, who's going to talk for a couple of minutes, and thank you.
Unaffordable annual pension contributions are causing a crowd out of our ability to invest in core government services such as public safety, education, and social services for our neediest residents. And at the same time, pension costs are driving what seem to be endless property and income tax hikes. These tax hikes have failed to solve our financial problems while contributing to a lagging state economy and consistent population loss. So I did some research, and from 2000 to today, spending on pensions after adjusting for inflation at the state level is up more than 500%. Spending on everything other than pensions, government worker health insurance, and education is actually down in real terms by 32%. That other category includes the state police budget, the budget for DCFS so we can protect at-risk children, MAP grants so poor students can go to college, child immunizations, social services for the disabled, just to name a few. Those are all down. At the local level, pensions are driving our rising property taxes, while cash-strapped cities are forced to lay off current police officers and firefighters to make their budgets work. My father is a 30-year career firefighter and paramedic. My stepfather is a retired tollway driver. My aunt and my daughter's mother are both public school teachers. And I truly believe in the importance of keeping our promise to provide our public servants with secure retirement benefits. But the status quo does not work for anyone. We did an actuarial analysis commissioned by a member of the audience and found that if we experience another major recession and the pension funds experience an asset loss similar to what they saw in 2009, they will enter a financial death spiral, with the first running out of money and being unable to pay full benefits as soon as 2039. A constitutional amendment that allows for adjustments in the future growth rate of benefits, but still protects every dollar earned to date, can enable thoughtful and balanced pension reform. It's a moral imperative that we act now while modest changes to the system can still fix it. We owe it to our retirees, to taxpayers, and to needy Illinoisans who rely on government services to finally solve this problem once and for all. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Thank you. I'm Laurence Msall, and I am just so pleased to be here with so many of you who are here to talk mostly about other people's pensions rather than your own. It's certainly my pleasure to be here and find myself in an interesting spot to the right of Adam and to the left of Senator Steans. Because we're all part of Kristen's book club, I have some recommended reading for those of you who have been working on this issue. It, of course, would be Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot, How the Illinois Legislature Solved the Pension Crisis. Seriously, though, we do have a situation that, as Adam so articulated, is one that is of great frustration to most of us. We know that there is something wrong with the state of Illinois. If you don't want to take mine or Adam or Senator Steans' word, look at the rating agencies, look at the cost that Illinois is bearing by not dealing with a situation that has looked out of hand for a long time. And so what's amazing is when you talk to people outside of Illinois, how befuddled they quickly become as to why we're not dealing with this situation. Why are we waiting for the problem to get bigger rather than solving it when we have the opportunity? Agree with Adam that definitely there needs to be a combination of many things in order to fix the state's financial situation. First of all, we do want to recognize the governor and the legislature. They did pass a budget. That didn't used to be such a big deal in 49 other states, but in Illinois, it's a big deal that we have a budget. There's savings in having a budget. We know that. There is no savings in not controlling your spending as the state constitution requires. Definitely agree that there has to be a combination. It cannot just be all revenue. We are losing population in Illinois and in Chicago. People are leaving for many reasons, but uncertainty is one of the most corrosive conditions a government and a population can have. We need to reverse that. It's not just a state problem. It's a local problem. There are no local taxpayers and state taxpayers as distinct bodies. There are just taxpayers, and we need to solve this by addressing it comprehensively. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So I'm Heather Steans. I've gotten the most commiseration calls ever when some people saw that I was doing this. Friday, I was speaking on a panel on cannabis for the Illinois Chamber, and I didn't get a single commiseration call in advance of that panel. So I am, really happy to bite the bullet for our caucus and be here talking about this today. I mean, I share the concern. It's a real problem, our pensions. We know there's a real problem here that does need to be solved. We have, at the state level, around $130 billion in the unfunded pension liability. We know that. As Laurence said, our bond ratings are very low, cost every level of state government additional cost in interest payments that they're making. And as Adam points out, the crowding out problem is real. When I first started in the legislature a little over 10 years ago, we paid about 6% of our general revenue fund on pensions, about 6% of our general revenue fund that way. It's now over 25% when you include in interest you're paying on pension obligation debt. And as pointed out, that means we can't be investing in education, human services, public safety, all those things we care about. That said, I do believe it's a solvable problem and that we need to do it in a realistic way that actually has chances for working. We have a moral obligation, in my view, not just to the taxpayers of Illinois, we do to them, we also do to our pensioners, to the public employees who have been betting on this. And what I think, one of the things I think people forget is that 80% of those receiving a public pension aren't also eligible for Social Security income, none. So, it's something for folks out there who also get Social Security to say we should change things, but this is their retirement. And we have an obligation there as well to not bankrupt or not to let them live dignified lives on their pensions that they were expecting. The easier it is to solve, the faster we get to it. So that is something we should be, rolling up our sleeves and getting to. 5 different areas, or really 4 I'll talk about, and then there's some other things that we could look at. Some of the areas that I think we could be looking at right now that make some sense. Obviously, one thing that comes up is you can dedicate additional funds to pension payments and make that real. progressive income tax, if that's on the ballot and is successful, that is expected to bring in about $3.4 billion. Some significant portion of that should be dedicated to pensions. There could be other ways of looking at additional revenue sources too that have a nexus to retirement income that we could be talking about in a really progressive fashion. Certainly that's something we need to be talking about. We have the consideration model that we passed twice in the Senate, which is something that at one point labor had supported, not sure that they do at this point. It's something that I think could at least maybe be tested on an individual basis to see how that stands constitutionally. That model says that if you give up your compounded COLA in the future, you will be able to keep all salary increases you get pensionable. And if you don't want to keep, if you're willing to, if you want to keep your increases in the future, your salary increases pensionable, then you can keep your compounded COLA the way it is. I mean, you can make some trade-offs in this. As long as you're willing to make some trade-offs, and we estimate that you can get about $1 billion in saving a year on a consideration model if you're doing it at the state level. We also think it may be constitutional. Last, third thing, we could be looking at consolidating some of the local pension funds. I know Laurence, and he's got a team that's been looking at this very deeply. You could certainly do it at a minimum for the administration and financial costs for that. You could also be taking a look more broadly at how do we have the state then help with the debt associated with those local pension funds. Obviously, that's something that's of concern around the state. I think everything should be on the table. We should be at least looking at these options. You know, and then finally, in context of doing other things, we should look at the amortization schedule. Some groups look at that very seriously. Right now, the way our schedule works, and this was passed in 1995 under the Edgar administration, the way we paid it all was, you know, start low now, way up in the future, and we're on that ramp, which is why you see our pension costs going through the roof right now. We're on that ramp schedule. In 2045, it goes from about $19 billion down to $2 billion in payments. Nobody would write an amortization schedule that way. And in context, that's something we should be looking at. There's other things we could be taking a look at as well. You know, we've done some pension buyouts. Asset transfers is something the governor's got to work for, a task force looking at. There may be other things as well. But I do think ultimately this is solvable. I get frustrated when people suggest that the Illinois, the General Assembly and the state have not been doing things, however. In 2011, we implemented a Tier 2 pension system that dramatically changes pensions for employees hired as 2011 on. That's already done. So we've already made significant changes that up the retirement age and that really change the compounded COLA that folks get into the future. That's been changed. It's a legacy cost we're dealing with now. We also in 2013 did something around current active retirees who had already been employed by the state, and it was thrown out unanimously by the Illinois Supreme Court. So I think we have to be realistically the way we go about approaching this. We're not going to be able to impair those benefits. We think the court's been giving us very clear standards about that, and we have to look at this in a realistic way that protects both employees as well as the taxpayers in the state. And the big message I have is I really do think it's solvable. Faster we get to it, the easier it is to solve.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you for taking the bullet for your caucus. I don't know how many people they had to go down the list to find a lawmaker willing to sit in this room, but we appreciate you being here. And I mean, obviously, you've studied this, you know a lot about pensions in Springfield. But I want to ask all of you, but especially Adam and Laurence, since you've studied this so much, there does seem, you know, the temperature on this issue has really fallen. And Springfield, you know, they left town in May, and it was a lot of celebrating about marijuana and legalized gambling, and those were issues that were festering for a long time. But they didn't do anything, again, on pensions that was meaningful or structural. There seems to be this belief now that we can actually pay our way out of this. And could either of you address that? I look at the numbers. We have been making that ramp payment, I think, for the last 7 years, and the unfunded liability is still growing. So to me, that says this is not doable. Are any of the solutions that you're hearing doable? Can we pay our way out? Adam, I'll start with you.
No. Is the short answer. The benefits cannot be paid. They will not be paid at the existing benefit levels. JP Morgan Bank has an analyst, Michael Semblist, who looked at this and found what are states paying today and what's the gap between what they would have to pay to make full actuarial payments, not the legally required payments, but the actuarial payments to actually eliminate the debt. And in order to do it under a typical, actuarial schedule, we'd have to go from spending 26% of our budget on pensions to 51%. It's about a $10 billion increase in the $10.2 billion we're paying right now. You can't do that on the backs of rich people. You can't do it with a progressive income tax. The middle class certainly can't afford a tax hike of that size. So there's no way these benefits will be paid off. And I think a lot of the efforts that people are taking to sort of get creative with accounting games to try to solve it, things like reamortization, pension obligation bonds, anything where you see them changing the ramp or reducing current contributions where it's not tied to benefit levels. Those are things that actually grow the debt burden and make the problem worse in the long run, likely to lead to a credit downgrade. So I think we also have to remember, the history here is in, 2011, they did Tier 2, 2013, they did the attempt at benefit reform that was thrown out by the court. And both the mayor of Chicago at the time, as well as the governor, promised this concept of shared sacrifice. Taxpayers were going to pay more and pensioners were going to see a haircut in benefits. And again, that doesn't have to mean cutting anything somebody's currently receiving. And only one side of that shared sacrifice equation happened. Taxpayers paid more, whether you're talking about local taxpayers, property taxes, income taxes, we're all paying more for these pension benefits. We're contributing more to them than we ever have been. And there's been nothing done on the other side of the ledger. So we already have one of the highest combined state and local tax burdens. We already spend the most in the nation, about double the national average, on pension benefits as a percentage of our revenues. We cannot tax our way out of it. We cannot pay these debts down without changing the benefits themselves. The reform has to look there.
It's hard to argue with Adam when he lays out what we have done in the past in terms of tax effort. But I think the response from the Civic Federation and from me is when you ask the basic question, can we pay our way out of this? The more direct answer from us is we don't know because we haven't tried to pay. One of the big problems for people who don't want or don't believe that we can change the Constitution to allow for some reasonable change in the benefit is they don't have a plan to paying for these benefits going forward. We have not fully funded the pension obligation going immediately or going forward. It's important, I think, and beneficial to look at what best practices would be. They would not be what we have in Illinois. They would not be 650 local police and fire pension funds, all with their own boards, all with restrictions set by the state statute, not only as to what the benefits are, determined by the state, not the locals, not who the members are, decided by the state, not by the locals, not what the funding source, decided by the state, not the locals, and call that a local pension. It's not a local pension. It's a local obligation that the state has created. So we don't know really what state would look like if we tried to. We definitely can't afford the current structure. We can't afford paying as much of our budget right now as we are into the pensions. That's not keeping up with the actuarial required contribution. So the biggest challenge that we have and why the temperature seems kind of cold is because the public is not hearing innovative ways to address the core problem of what's possible to change. We have to build confidence that our government has the ability to manage a big problem. We think it is very much a math problem and one of political will. Are we going to fix this problem? Are we going to create a restructuring of the local pensions? Why does Chicago have a separate pension system from the state of Illinois? Well-run states, well-funded public employee pension benefit programs don't have this many units. We think there is the possibility that if you combine both cuts in the unfunded liability, structural changes, you can dramatically increase the investment returns. Governance reform is a big part of it. And the less bodies that you have, the easier it is to watch them. But more importantly, if you concentrate all of the publicly provided assets together, you can bring professionals in to manage and make sure you get the greatest return rather than political decisions and political compromises.
Thank you. Do you want to follow up, Senator? Okay, I just wanted to get back to, and I hate putting Senator Steans on the hot seat all the time here, but in terms of a constitution, the legislature did, like you mentioned in 23, already vote on curbing cost of living. I know the court struck it down, but it is a court that has also upheld what we have considered on the Tribune editorial board to be almost fraudulently obtained pensions from people who substitute taught for a day, from union leaders who were able to pay into the pension system and then have their higher salaries applied toward it. Why isn't there more of a movement in Springfield, since you are all on the record, or those of you who voted for that 2013 bill, going after COLAs and freezing them and extending retirement ages? Why is it so hard to have a discussion about just putting it on the ballot, and then if you don't like it, you can try to convince voters to turn it down? But why is that such a difficult conversation?
Well, first of all, we have voted on doing that. I mean, we created the whole Tier 2 system. To say that there's not been a conversation in Springfield around making changes to make these sustainable, we have had that. It was, fully debated. It was not an easy one. And I can tell you, it was certainly, it's hard to do in a democratically controlled legislature as well. And we did it. It was done in 2013, not that long ago. And now a great number of our active employees are now in those new systems as well. So that's really been changing the trajectory of this over time as well. In terms of the constitutional amendment, which I think is what you're referring to, I try to be practical and realistic about what are we going to actually be able to accomplish. So I don't think if we wait for a constitutional amendment to get on the ballot and passed, I don't think we solve this problem. One, you're going to have to get it passed through the legislature, which is not at all sure that we could do. Second, you would have to then, it's going to be on the ballot, and there'll be a well-funded campaign against it. Of that, I can guarantee you. So does that even pass on the ballot? I don't know. I think that there's things, and the other belief I have is that some of the attorneys that we have who really have been living and breathing this constitutional issue around pensions believe that other parts of our Constitution, even if we change the pension clause, would preclude us from being able to take away COLA benefits for those current employees who'd already been promised those, who were there in the Tier 1 system. They think that the takings clause that we have here would not allow that to happen in any event, even if we change the pension clause. I just think that that's going to spend a lot of time and energy, change the focus onto something that's not very realistic to happen. I'd much rather have our limited ability to focus on what we're going to do here to be pragmatic, reasonable, and something we hope to actually be able to achieve.
So pensioners clapping. To Senator Steans' point, on the court, what is if a constitutional amendment is not the solution to get around that ruling, do you think a consideration model or something else should be floated up the flagpole to be tested in the courts? What is?
I think that merits serious consideration. We've passed it twice in the Senate. The first time, unions supported it. The second time, not. Again, too, I really do believe we should have labor at the table working with us on this. I think that's the best way of go. You talk about Arizona. Arizona accomplished change because they did negotiate. It was a negotiation between the elected officials and labor. And it has not been tested in the court yet. Nobody is sued around it. They have the same constitutional clause. I'm not sure it would pass the constitutional muster if it was challenged, but because people work together on it, it hasn't been challenged yet. So I think the consideration model at least presents an opportunity for us in what I think is much more likely to pass constitutional muster, a real way forward of, in a fair way, through a contractual methodology, say you employees have an option here, but we taxpayers can also have some reduction in our unfunded liability. I think it does merit testing.
I think this is a question for Adam. It's from City Club member Amanda Holman. How do we prevent the outcome of pension reform being workers getting screwed out of money they are rightfully owed? How do we protect their interests?
It's a great question, first of all, something I'm also concerned about. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I have family members who are either public workers or public retirees in the state of Illinois. And the answer is we just need to bring our legal protections for pensions in line with other states. So currently, the Supreme Court, in that unanimous ruling has said that the pension clause prevents changes to earned benefits and unaccrued future benefits. As of day one of hire, the entire benefit formula is guaranteed for life. That's not common. Most states don't do that. Even states with pension clauses specifically in their constitution, places like Michigan, Louisiana, Hawaii, recognize a distinction between benefits somebody's already earned and the future growth rate in those benefits. So for example, things like the cost of living adjustment, and they say that you can't take away anything somebody's already got. So if you're a retiree and you're getting $3,000 a month in your check, that can never go down. But we have to allow adjustments to the future for work, not yet tendered, services not yet tendered. And for retirees, we need to be able to make their COLA in line with real economic realities. So the reforms that were passed in 2013 were not draconian. They were fairly modest, increasing the retirement age up to a maximum of 5 years for younger workers. Nobody under the age of 45 would have saw an increase. The only people who would have seen an increase of 5 years would be people who are 32 or younger, and they still would have gotten a COLA. It just would have been pegged to inflation, so it would be an actual cost of living increase, because right now it's not a cost of living increase, it's a guaranteed post-retirement raise. It has nothing to do with the price level in the economy, nothing to do with the amount of inflation. We haven't been over 3% inflation since 2008, and since 1990 when the COLA first started, we're only averaging about 2.4% inflation over that whole time period. So that's simply unsustainable. It doubles the size of somebody's benefit over the course of 25 years. If you retired with a $40,000 annual pension, it'll be $80,000 after 25 years. There's no way to make that math work. So the reform package we've put forward is very clearly focused on reducing the size of the liability with thoughtful, balanced reforms that still leave in place a very generous, very secure retirement for public workers.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to say, I voted for that reform package to the consternation of many. But it was found unanimously unconstitutional by the court, which is why I think we have to try a different approach, and why I do think that the consideration model just provides a really different legal framework for trying to see whether we might make rational changes here to help bring down the cost.
To Senator Steans' point, that the Senate has revisited that idea of consideration and the House has ignored it. But really, there's no plan B since 2015. So we are still 4 years and running of really just taking the word of the court, not trying to float up another option, not trying to do something like a constitutional amendment, no plan B. And I wonder if any of you could talk about Arizona. I know it's not an exact apple-to-apple comparison, but that is a state that has this very similar language that a pension is a contract that can't be diminished or impaired. They got the unions on board because the unions looked at the math. They had COLAs that were attached to investment returns, so they were very generous. It was unanimous and bipartisan to at least put the question on the ballot to just curb the growth of the pensions. Nobody's talking about eliminating pensions. All of these discussions are about curbing future growth, and they're able to do it in other states. So I wonder if you could weigh in on what is different here that we cannot seem to get past. We've heard Senator Steans talk a lot about the power of unions and just a lack of reality and looking at the math. Why can't we get something done in this state when other states are moving forward?
First off, there's nothing different or unique about Illinois and Chicago. We're part of the same economic principles. We are going to suffer the same downturn if there is an economic downturn, which is likely the next couple of years. The only difference is we're ill prepared for what those downturns are going to be. People's understanding about having the security of a state guaranteed pension or a publicly guaranteed pension that is 17% funded is something that's unique, that hasn't really caught on, it doesn't seem, in terms of the willingness to address this. The Illinois phenomenon of the willingness to recognize that you recognize we're in a crisis and then wait to see what happens is really what drives the political discourse in Springfield. We should be bringing things every year to the forefront of how we're going to address this problem, how we're going to improve it. It is not going to be one thing. The public is getting, thanks to the City Club, thanks to all of you who, read the local newspapers and pay attention. There's a lot of information about the crisis and how much of the pension obligation is driving state and local government. There hasn't been a full-throated discourse in Springfield on putting all the options on the table. We hoped that the changes would have been found by our Supreme Court. We were surprised by the elected members of our Supreme Court, not by their decision necessarily to throw out reasonable reforms that many of us thought of, but to offer nothing for the government in terms of what it could do. It cannot be the answer that Illinois just waits to see how it turns out as more and more people leave our state, as our city now is, cities across the state of Illinois are being brought to their knee. It is a crisis of very, very great significance, and our public officials need to step up and address it. The public will follow reasonable plans. The business community has introduced several different initiatives aimed at addressing a comprehensive approach, whether it's the Civic Committee of the Commercial Club or the Civic Federation. Other groups have come out and said, yes, it could be a combination. But if we only do one thing, if we only address a portion of the revenue problem, we're going to continue to lose people, and it's going to be a bigger problem.
If I could throw out the Lori Lightfoot question and start with Senator Steans. Do you get the sense that having the leader of Chicago sort of putting one foot out on this issue, and she's been a little unclear, let's be clear about that, as to what she actually supports. She did a round of editorial board meetings, and in some places it sounded like she kind of opposed the idea of a graduated income tax. Then she came out for it. She at our editorial board meeting was not completely opposed to a constitutional amendment. Then her spokesperson came out later and said she was. Bigger question, what do you think that a movement among mayors, and maybe starting with the momentum that she has, would change any minds in Springfield on moving toward a more permanent solution?
Well, so certainly, having her out talking about this just continues to bring public attention to the issue, and I think that's helpful. I think it's really, though, this is a statewide issue, and I think it needs to be addressed in a statewide fashion, and I think developing that sense of coalition is just good and helpful. It's not Chicago alone. We've got Peoria. We've got Alton, Illinois, who's had to sell off their water system to try to help make payments. We've got Kankakee that's having problems. Harvey. You look around the state, we have lots of municipalities that are struggling because of how to manage their pension systems. And Laurence speaks about the fact that they're trying to do it on their own, when a lot of the systems that are in place are created at the state level. So there is a real disconnect, and historically, in how this stuff has come to be. I think a lot of my colleagues understand that. They're hearing a lot more about it. The Illinois Municipal League has certainly been taking a look at how might we try to help statewide deal with these issues. I think it's going to take that kind of a statewide coalition, quite frankly, to get something to happen. I'm hopeful. As I say, my colleagues really do hear more and more often now about this as a problem. That just helps. People need to actually be educated themselves and talk to their state legislators about why they need to weigh in on this and actually get involved, and can't bury your head in the sand about it. I think one of the issues is we've been hearing for decades about, literally decades, about the notion of how serious our pensions are and they're going to collapse, we're going to go bankrupt. Well, that's never actually happened. So it's easy to then think, okay, maybe everyone's just always crying wolf all this time. You need to actually sort of marry that with, here's what we can actually do, here's why it's different now, what's actually happening at the ground level. And those local mayors and folks need to keep taking that, I think, to their legislators to be making that case. That all said, I really do believe there's a moment in time where we have an opportunity to do something. I think this is solvable. I think people need to be, instead of yelling across at each other on this, people should be working behind closed doors more in cooperation and how to actually realistically get us there. I don't think sort of the polarization on the sides is helpful in what's going to actually get us to a solution.
In terms of, we're often pointing fingers on the editorial page and elsewhere at legislative leaders. Do you get the sense that there is enough pressure from lawmakers putting pressure on legislative leaders? Why do they get to be the blockade that continues to stir the pot on this? And again, this is a question for Senator Steans, but the rest of you, what is your sense of whether Mike Madigan and John Cullerton are serious about doing something about this and urgently?
Well, listen, I'm in the Senate, so that's the leader I know, and I can tell you, there, without a doubt in my mind, 100% to my core, know that this is something that Senate President Cullerton takes seriously and does feel is an urgent issue that we need to be addressing. I've never seen him shy away from it, so absolutely 100%.
I think it's too easy to let our leaders off the hook and let the members who are sent there on behalf of us, because those of us that aren't lucky enough to live in Senator Cullerton or Speaker Madigan's district don't get to vote for them. We elect our own members, right? And then our own members are really the place where I think there's not enough pressure, right? There isn't an answer coming from individual members as to what they're prepared to do, what they're willing to do. This is not politically attractive or easy. If it was, it would have been done a long time ago. And so what we really need is the public to continue to be aware, and certainly the Tribune editorials and other publication that point out that we haven't addressed this issue is very helpful. Mayor Lightfoot recognizing that she faces $1 billion budget shortfall and has basically only offered two tools from Springfield, raise the property tax or raise the sales tax as the main answers. It increases people's awareness, but it's the same problem in cities all over the state of Illinois. We need our legislature, which created these pensions, which created the benefits, which established in statute everything, the funding and everything else, to address that. There needs to be more openness of ideas and try things that maybe people assume will be too hard, or maybe they don't want to. But until we realize that the state is not moving forward without addressing this, then it doesn't seem like we'll have the political will.
I actually think this question relates back to your question earlier about Arizona, because you said it's not an apples to apples comparison. But in many ways it is. The biggest difference between Illinois and Arizona on this issue is politics. In Arizona, the Great Recession exposed the underlying, structural instability in their pension system, just like it did here. And I say exposed because the Great Recession didn't cause these problems. It just showed that these systems are unsustainable. Arizona tried to amend their pensions via statute. Their state Supreme Court said no, their pension clause doesn't allow it. They recognized that that was the problem. So rather than trying to be creative and skirt the problem, they addressed it head on. The pension clause wasn't allowing them to make the changes that the people of the state and the elected leaders of the state saw that they needed to make, so they attacked it head on. I think Senator Steans is absolutely right. Every state that has been successful with pension reform has eventually brought public sector unions to the table. But we have to be realistic that maybe they should be the ones driving the effort because these funds are at the risk of insolvency. They're not going to drive the effort. So it's up to all of us and to elected leaders in Springfield in particular to bring them to the table, to tell them that this is happening and to get them to negotiate because they're not going to do it of their own initiative.
Yeah, that's a good point. Just a couple questions and then I think we have to wrap up. But in terms of what Adam was just saying, it is a frustration, I think, of me writing about this for going on now like 15 or 20 years, is that it's really up to voters. And voters have responded to the pension crisis by increasing the majorities in the House and Senate of Democrats and overturning the governor's mansion. So really, we can sit here and point fingers, but it really does come down to voters and what's important to them. I just wanted to touch on, before we leave, it's one of the more topic areas that seems to be moving along. Could you each just very briefly touch on what you think about consolidating all of the public safety funds, if that would really make much of a difference? The idea is to try to increase investment returns by having sort of a bigger pool of money. And also, is anyone talking about allowing those local pension funds to invest, to kind of take the handcuffs off of what their restrictions are in terms of what they can invest in, maybe as part of that or separately?
I think those are both good ideas, especially in conjunction. Right now, there's limitations on how police and fire local pension boards can make their investments, and there's been some efforts to loosen that and give them more flexibility. I think if you have a larger asset pool as a result of consolidation, that can be a particularly good change. However, I do want to very strongly caution that neither of those is a solution on its own. Consolidating pension funds will save you a little bit on administrative costs, and it'll enable you to get better asset returns on your investments. But to the extent that that's going to help, it'll just help make the projections match reality. Because right now, the 10-year average of investment returns is 4.6%. And we're counting on about 7% in these funds. And to show you how far we'd have to come for this to actually solve the problem, that Michael Semblist analysis I mentioned earlier found that we would have to average 11.5% for 20 years to actually solve this. We're at 4.6. So, counting on higher investment returns isn't going to solve this on its own. It's something we can do to, help make the systems more efficient, but it does nothing to deal with the debt, the liability that's really at the core of this problem. And just to be clear, that liability is current workers and current retirees. Nothing you do that changes it only for new entrants, including Tier 2, addresses the existing problem. There's no way out of this without addressing benefits for current workers and current retirees. And again, you can protect what they've earned, but that's where the liability is.
Thank you.
Consolidation won't be a little, it will be a big step if the state of Illinois goes forward. It will be bringing best practices. There will be savings because you will have better governance, ideally, if you consolidate. You will be moving the responsibility from a diffuse municipal police and fire pension fund, 650 around the state, ideally into one. You could look across the border in Wisconsin and see how that worked out. It works out much better. It also affords the opportunity to change the notion as to who is basically managing the investments. Right now, we have a system where people are asked to do double duty at the local level. You both can be a financial expert and help deal with investment strategy, but also be a medical doctor so you can figure out whether someone's injury is work-related or not. And if you take the minutes from most of the police and fire pension funds, including Chicago, you will see a lot more time is spent figuring out whether someone's medical condition is work-related or not compared to what the best way to return. So it would be an enormous step. It would be one that would recognize that there are better ways than the current model in Illinois, and it would put us in a place where it would be much more accountable, the consolidation of the pensions. The next big step after that is recognizing who created the liability and who is going to be responsible for paying for it. It wasn't created by the locals. It was created by state statute. The locals, that being the taxpayers, are the ones that are on the hook. Would you rather have it managed on a broad base, on a low rate, or try to let each individual municipality try and figure it out the best they can? And so far, that has not worked well in Illinois.
Okay, and let's have Senator Steans have the last word on that.
Yes, well, I certainly agree that this is something we should be looking at. I don't think we should take anything off the table. I think Laurence and the Civic Federation, as well as the Municipal League, have been doing a lot of great work on this, giving us lots of suggestions on how we might go about it. And I think we should be analyzing all of that and taking steps. I mean, I think it makes a lot of sense to look at how in the best way of consolidating.
Well, thank you for coming to my pension book club. And if you're around this Friday, I'll be tweeting probably around 9:30 from my couch. So feel free to join the conversation with Jane and I. And thank you for coming.
Thanks for watching. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to our channel. And while you're at it, please leave us a comment. Thank you for watching.